Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michelle Ekstrom at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And today we are continuing our series of webinars focused on an opportunity to continue to provide ongoing learning for legislators and legislative staff, even as you are busy with your sessions. We've been focusing on a series of webinars on high-quality teaching, and today we have the good fortune of learning a little bit more about what professional learning looks like in Canada and some lessons that we might be able to learn from Canada to apply here in our states. With me today, I have Stephanie Hirsch, Executive Director of Learning Forward, and Audrey Hobbs-Johnson, the Project Manager for the Canadian study that Learning Forward just completed, and Rod Allen, who is Superintendent of the Cowichan Valley School District in British Columbia. I'm going to, at this time, ask Stephanie to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome everyone. We're really honored with this opportunity to share with you information about professional learning in Canada. And let me just set a little bit of a context so that our expert Canadians will have the opportunity to talk about the implications and the results from the study. So first of all, for those of you unfamiliar with Learning Forward, we are a membership organization with about 13,000 members in the U.S. and abroad, and about 40,000 subscribers who get a weekly update from us about the state of professional learning. We like to think of ourselves as an authority on issues related to professional development and school improvement, and we are the only professional association that's focused solely on the role of professional learning in improving leadership, teaching, and student success. You can see from this next slide that we stand behind several beliefs as a foundation for our work, and I'm assuming these are probably statements that we hope resonate with many of the legislators and others who are joining us in today's conference call. I appreciate, most importantly, that one of the things that we stand for is that more students will achieve when our educators are assuming collective responsibility for student learning. On our last two beliefs on the next slide indicate that we believe that, effective school systems do commit to continuous improvement for all adults and all students. And I know this is a familiar theme in the study that you have been doing of other high-performing countries around the world. Our vision as an association that you see on the next slide is that of we want to advance excellent teaching and learning every day, and qualify that we mean for all educators and students as well. And our mission is about building the capacity of the leaders in organizations who have the responsibility for establishing and sustaining highly effective professional learning to support our educators. I want you to know that the study today was actually preceded by a study that we conducted in 2007 with the help of Linda Darling Hammond and the Scope Center, where we looked at the state of professional learning in the U.S. And as a result of that study, the Scope Center published 4 different reports on what we could learn about professional learning in the U.S. and also did some state comparisons. All 4 studies are available on our website, and I can give you the link to those later on in the webinar if you'd like to learn some things about what we said about your state in 2007. Because that particular study was really important for launching a great conversation in the U.S., and we knew we were having a conference hosting our annual conference in Vancouver in 2016. And you can see from this slide the conference program and a little bit of the inside of the conference. We decided that it was important to replicate that conversation so that we could learn from we could learn about the state of professional learning in Canada, since we would be investing so much time learning in that country. So we were excited to partner with leaders in Canada so that this study could take place. And it would be an opportunity to collect baseline data about professional learning, as you can see on the next slide, and to spur discussion at the policy and decision-making levels within the country, and also begin to think about what would be the next actions that could be taken at the district, and in Canada it would be at the provincial level. So in order to tell you about what we learned in Canada from our Canadian neighbors and the potential implications for us in the U.S., I want to first turn over the conversation to my colleague and project director, Audrey Hobbs-Johnson from British Columbia. Audrey, I'll let you take it from here for a moment.
Thanks, Stephanie. It was a great honor to work on this project. And we really looked at the Linda Darling Hammond project in the U.S., and it was really fashioned after that. I want to give credit to Carol Campbell and her team of researchers. We had researchers across the country in 4 different universities. The piece, I think I just want to set a context for Canada. I'm going to do it very quickly because my colleague Rod will come on later and join me and talk in more detail to this. But our country is so large, and we actually don't have a national institution, so to speak, for education. Education in Canada is a provincial or territorial responsibility. So in each province and in each territory, we have our legislatures work autonomously, and then across the country we do have something called CMAC, which is the Council for Education Ministers, which is similar to the group that we're having a conversation with today. We are among the top countries in the world. We are also among the countries in the world who have very high poverty rates. Our Indigenous students are at disadvantage. And it's that piece that we wanted to look at is, so if we have this problem in our country, we do not have a lot of money, how is it that we're making the difference for our young people that we are? Because our scores are high. You can see by the chart that's sitting there now, the PISA scores were good for us. But what you will see later, and I want you to keep in mind, is looking at another graph that Rod will talk about where the equity scores are more important for us than the actual scores across the country, because it's important that our students that are at risk are receiving the kind of attention that they need to have. Here are the list of studies that we're doing. They're on Learning Forward on the web. We were fortunate to have Michael Fullen and Andy Hargraves take the studies when we finished them late last fall and do a summary called Bringing the Profession Back In. And I strongly recommend that as reading. We're going to go through the all pieces that we have. We have a Cross Canada research study that looks at every interviewed in every jurisdiction. And then we have 3 in-depth case studies. One is in British Columbia, one is in Alberta, and one will be coming out of Ontario. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that if we didn't have our educators engaged, that we were not doing a very good job. And that meant that it wasn't policy but culture that was making the difference. That where we had highly successful engagement of educators, teachers, district leaders, our provincial leaders, that there was a culture that actually embraced professional learning as a key component of both student and teacher success. And then the policy reflected that culture. So that is really what we learned. We're going to look at what we learned in 3 pieces. The context, what does it look like? It looks very different in Toronto and Vancouver than it looks in the Northwest Territories, or it looks like in rural Saskatchewan. and that was a big piece for us. Once we had that culture, that context is in place, what did the process look like? What were the kinds of things that were making a difference? And then what was the content that needed? And the content is different. The content that we needed in British Columbia was much different than the content we needed in another province. However, the process that educators used to get there was very similar. One of our findings was it was really important to have a broad range of student and professional learning outcomes. One size doesn't fit all. It was a priority for the teachers to identify what they needed to improve their practice. And then, but as they're doing that, it was really important to have teachers and especially school and district administrators together to prioritize what their learners needed so that those two were aligned. That was a key finding. Where we had that, we had success. No one size fits all. We really believe that with a passion, that it looks different in Regina, Saskatchewan, than it looks in London, Ontario. Rod, I know you're on the line. Do you want to jump in here and talk about no one size fits all?
Sure. Thanks, Audrey, and hello, everyone. Sorry, I was a few minutes late getting on the call. What's really important, I think, is that we're not trying to jam square pegs into round holes, and we are ensuring that especially our teachers, have a variety of models, a variety of opportunities for their professional learning, and a great deal of say over what they're learning, as much as how they're learning, because that is a big part of the buy-in to do it. It can't feel, certainly in British Columbia, it can't feel top-down or imposed. It has to be seen as a vital support for the learning of kids, that the adults dealing with the kids have the opportunities to do the learning they need. The learning needs of the students will determine the learning needs of the adults. We know in British Columbia that we learn well together, and I think that's true of people across the world. We work well together, and our teachers are highly connected, and the more we have teachers working together and learning together, the better that is for all of us. And British Columbia, we understand professional networks, and we've been using professional network models for a while. And it's something that we're pretty good at. We know that just like for student learning, things need to be job embedded. It's not something, professional learning isn't something that should always happen at midnight trying to read that book, or on a Saturday or Sunday trying to go to some course. While those opportunities are fine, it also has to be job embedded, and that's part of the learning culture we try to establish that Audrey was speaking of.
Let me jump in a little bit more about the culture, because as we watched this unfold across the country, and last week when I was in Alberta, the conversation went in depth around how do you build relationships? Because until those relationships are built among the learners, whether they be the principals in your district office, whether they be the people for us in BC, the Victoria legislatures, how do you build that trust and those relationships that will allow people to work together and be comfortable? Because that's really where we found the deepest engagement and the most, so to speak, the most bang for your buck, because that's really was important. I'm going to say a little bit about professional networks. And then I want Rod to jump in as well here. The slide that you see now, you see a series of things: professional networks, workshops, conferences, online platforms. They all make a difference. But the piece that really has the most improvement for student learning attached to teacher learning or educator learning are professional networks. And we found those key, and I think other researchers that have looked at Canada certainly have seen the same. Rod, a little bit more about professional networks and inquiry.
Yeah, for us, those two things go together. You can't really do inquiry, which is asking great questions, questions related to the learning needs of students, which is the fundamental keystone to our professional learning models that work well in British Columbia, without having networks that support that inquiry and those inquiry kinds of projects. So the two things really go hand in hand. We would say that other opportunities like conferences and workshops and institutes and those kinds of things, those are great places to learn things. Those are where you can find knowledge. But we also know that that's not enough. It's also how you understand and apply that knowledge and that learning, and that happens on the ground through inquiry projects and through our professional support by our professional networks. And so we kind of make a distinction. You need an ecosystem of all of those pieces in it. However, the actual doing of it happens at the professional network level and at the inquiry, school-based inquiry level.
Ron. One of the pieces that was common across the country, obviously, is the time. But it's more important to look at time that is sustained cumulative professional learning. I think one of the mistakes we made in this country a few years ago is we would look at, we're going to do reading, and there would be a program on reading. It would be mandated by either the provincial level or a district level. We would do it for 12 months, and now we've done that, and we moved on to something else. I think I know what the research says very clearly is that it has to be sustained, and it has to be cumulative, and it has to be integrated, so that in a classroom things just don't happen. We're getting away from having a block for this and a block for that, and teacher learning needs to be the same. What does instruction look like, and what do I need to do to learn to be a more effective instructor, or a more effective teacher, or whatever term you're going to use? Rod, any comments on that?
I think you got it.
All right. Context is interesting, and that one of the dilemmas and the conversations that are going on in each province right now is around system coherence and teacher voice and self-directed professional judgment, so to speak. It's important that it isn't really a balance. It's really an alignment, so that if where I'm working as a teacher in grade 10 social studies, what is it that the students here need to become socially adept citizens? What is it I need to do? And that might be different, as I said earlier in this webinar. It will be different in northern Saskatchewan than it is in downtown Vancouver or downtown Montreal. So that it isn't a balance, it's an alignment. Rod.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in British Columbia, we worked very hard to set the culture prior to trying to navigate this dilemma or balance idea, that what if there was no difference between the aims and goals of self-directed professional learning and system-directed? What if we were all actually aligned and had built a coherent approach to moving forward? We went for that. We kind of went for the big gold ring and got it by having lots of conversations, including teachers deeply in the transformed curriculum, assessments, all those things that have happened that I'll talk about a bit later. By including them in that and including the teachers deeply in the conversation from the beginning, we're not finding distinction between system-directed and self-directed. It's all the same things. And we're not having to have the professional autonomy battle over you're not the boss of me around my professional learning. We avoided that battle, and it didn't happen. Everyone's just sort of on the same page.
Right. And I think that, realistically speaking, that will always be an ongoing conversation, and it takes very talented facilitation and trust-building pieces to allow that to continue. We one of the pieces that came out loud and clear again is it's evidence informed. The data has to be there, but the data has to be converted into evidence, so that then I take the evidence and I look from there into an inquiry project. So what does this really mean in my context? And that leads to our teachers and our principals being able to make professional judgments about how they proceed. Rod?
Yeah, we've redefined evidence or re-envisioned what we mean by evidence. That's no longer just what did your students get on some sort of system-wide assessment of reading skills in grade 4 or whatever it might be. That's certainly an evidence point. But we look at we're using evidence as opposed to data quite with purpose, because we know that the evidence we want is also around as we look at our competencies in British Columbia, the well-being of our students, the mental health of our students, their ability to interact appropriately, and so on. So we're trying to use a wide range of evidence and encourage teachers to use a wide range of evidence. Of course, embedded in that continue to be the relatively standard and traditional pieces, reading, writing, math, etc. But making sure that that's a larger piece, because and I'll show you some data later on that as we look towards equity, actually all of our rates improved. And inquiry is connected into that. So it's using that wide range of evidence to find inquiry questions that are meaningful and that matter to individual teachers and to teachers collectively in a school or in a district has been important. And if it was just restricted to 2 or 3 types of data, we wouldn't have the buy-in that we do.
I think it allows us to actually be truthful around that we do look at equity, because the kinds of resources you put in some of our schools that where poverty, where English as a first language is a problem, or any of those pieces that we know, mental health, we're able to put those resources in, and it makes a difference. So one size doesn't fit all, but it's that inquiry and that creating the wide range of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Rod, and I think I've started to look at that at the next slide. So the variation on funding is varied, to say the least, across Canada. Our professional unions have a great deal to say about their professional learning, and our organizations across the country do as well. And that's one of the outcomes of this study is those organizations are now coming together to look at the questions that the study has raised and how do we go further. Rod?
Yeah, so in British Columbia, we spend approximately $66 million a year on teacher release and for professional learning. That's a provincial number, and that is, well, we've calculated that by the fact we have 6 non-instructional days embedded in the school year. Teachers get paid for those days, but there's no kids, and so that it costs us about $11 million a day to run the system. That's a couple-of-year-old number, so it's probably up to 12 or more. But $66 million is a big chunk of change to do that. However, there's still a great, and so that is standard across the province. However, though, there is fairly significant regional differences and district differences in how they're conceptualizing and funding professional learning opportunities for teachers. So it's not. It is still a bit of a broken playing field.
And I think the next one is self-explanatory. It's everybody, I think, in the system supports it. It's about creating the right kind of culture so that it's something that's collaborative. It's not somebody telling somebody else what to do, because we know if we have compliance, we don't have student improvement. We have people sitting in a room complying, and that doesn't bring education.
For sure, and we, I mean, I think another point here is that our principals and vice principals, our school leaders and our system leaders need to be seen as outstanding teachers.
Exactly.
And so we make a real point of, in my district, all of our principals and vice principals teach. I don't care how big a school you have, you're going to carve off something and you're going to teach it, because that's really important, and then participate in the professional learning along with everybody else. It's not, that's just for teachers and principals will go off and learn something else. Yeah, they have lots of other stuff they need to know. We'll find other ways to get that with principals, but from the learning perspective, we are all in the same game.
That goes right back to, I was reading Mark Tucker's blog this morning about Linda Darling-Hammond's new book, the Empowering book, I call it. And that's the same as Shanghai. We trust, to be a good educator means being an excellent teacher. And that has to be kept in mind.
Mm-hmm.
The next piece, as we go across Canada, these were some of the pieces that actually go across our country. It's a legal right and responsibility in Canada. All our teachers, most of our educators have a legal right to professional learning. It's done in different ways. The professional associations and networks exist not only for leaders, they exist for everybody. And some of the key work that's done, I would say, in Alberta, in Ontario, and BC, the three provinces, and Manitoba, actually, the provinces I know the best, the work is done around those professional associations and networks. The knowing-doing gap, that's a big piece. How do we know, but do we really understand, and can we apply it? Rod?
Well, it comes back to when will what we know change what we do? And that's been a big question for us, a foundational question for us in British Columbia. When will what we know change what we do? And those kinds of questions have really helped in British Columbia, and certainly in my current school district, frame a lot of the professional inquiry questions that are going on in schools. And it's actually led to some really interesting conversations with our union about some of our collective agreement provisions. So it's a rich question to ask, and it's one that's helped to frame how we're supporting professional learning.
It builds that culture, but there's no one right answer. I think that's one of the pieces that probably frustrates some of us. Sometimes it'd be nice just to know that answer and be able to move forward. However, it didn't work. The next one, the professional learning for leaders, is absolutely incredible and important. And that professional learning is how to be a collaborative leader. That's what the research told us. There are challenges underneath, and you can't make them go away by saying, oh, they don't exist. They're there. But that comes out of our leaders are trained in both teaching, which is the most important, and also leadership and management skills. Michael Fullen talks about the middle leadership strategy, and I encourage you to look at that. I think that's a great conversation to have at the principal level between districts and at district level with provincial or state networks. Rod, what are the enabling conditions that support the best practices? What did we find?
Definitely we found that this is far more about enabling than driving. And so those kinds of conditions that are sociocultural, that are emotional, that are professional, are far more important than an edict coming down from on top, thou shalt. At least in British Columbia, we know that doesn't work. That might get sort of a false sense of compliance, but it doesn't actually change anything. People only change their fundamental deep practice, and we're talking educators here. We're not talking people that make widgets. If they want to, and if they understand the reasons why they should, and if they see it benefiting, that this change that they're going to have to struggle through will benefit the learning of their students. And so the list you see, those are all key areas: social, cultural, professional, political, economic, emotional, are all really key levers into changing culture. And so it's changing culture around professional learning and student learning that gets us to enabling the actual change.
If you look in for your reading pleasure in the set of studies that have been released so far, you'll see some really, I think, powerful examples of each of those that give us a picture of what has been successful and the differences they've made. So I encourage you to read those. This is an interesting slide, government or school. There's a big divide in there. There's a big space between government and school. How do you make it work? Everybody has a role. Rod?
Yeah. In British Columbia, we have had over the years large arguments or fights between government and essentially the teachers union, and it comes down to who owns the classroom, who's in charge. And we have found in the last 5 years, by a fairly radically different approach that I'll talk about in a few minutes, that's actually not the question. It's just coming to an understanding that we collectively are all responsible for all the kids. And there's government role, and there's union role, and there's district role, and there's individual teacher role, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really a false dichotomy. It's how are we all working collectively and coherently to support the learning needs of our kids.
Absolutely. So the conclusion of the study, the actual Canadian study, is pretty clear. We have a collective responsibility, and we need to approach it from a collective attitude, from a collective background, and so it's that collective responsibility that is the most important. The end of the study actually has some conclusions, but in the BC study, there is no conclusion. There are 3 questions. And it's those 3 questions, I think, that will be the most powerful to move the conversation forward. And I think going back to what Stephanie said in the beginning, the reason for this study was to create the context so we could raise the status of professional learning in our country, raise the awareness, and then continue to raise the quality. Because we know, even though we're successful on paper, we have a long way to go, and we've got many of the same problems that you have that we need to overcome for all of each kid, each student. We need to continue that. Now, if I could move this slide, we would be happy. There we are. We did a case study in Alberta, and that was done through the University of Alberta, Alberta Teachers Association and their regional consortium, and again, it's published. You can read that. It has many of the same findings of BC, but it has a different context. Alberta, every province has the ability and the right and needs to attend to the context. In British Columbia, our study was done in a different kind of a way, in that we were able to put together a consortium. And the people you see there are the actual authors. We hired 2 writers. The British Columbia Teachers Federation did some of the work in kind for us, and their research department gave us the writers. But all of the associations you see there worked together for 2 years to actually put the case study together. And one of the architects of that case study is Rod. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod.
Thanks, Audrey. And hello more officially, everybody. So my role here is I'm currently the superintendent of schools in the Cowichan Valley School District. We are on Vancouver Island, sort of around the middle of the island. We have 7,600 students, just about 7,700 students, a very diverse population, large numbers of First Nation students. Prior to this, and I've been in this role for about 1.5 years, prior to that, I was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Education in British Columbia. and got to lead the transformation work in the province, trying to bring parties together for a new and different conversation, trying to create a synergy and a coherent approach to learning amongst all the parties, and getting agreement and consensus that we needed to do some things differently, even though we were a high-functioning district. So I'm sort of coming from those two kinds of perspectives, and lived a life of working with at the coalface, at the interface with politicians in our legislature. So these questions, we call it the learning fractal, and the questions I've been using throughout my career, whether I've been a teacher, whether I've been a school principal, a superintendent of schools, or the person who's in charge of the learning of 660,000 students across the province. How's the learning? How do we know, and what are we doing about it? Or what are we going to do differently to get different results? It's insanity to keep doing the same things and thinking that that's going to lead to some sort of change. So it's getting to something different for all of our kids. Let me give you just a little bit of background back to BC. Lest you think we are a hugely privileged place. We are. We live in paradise. It's gorgeous. British Columbia has the highest child poverty rate of any province in the country. Not something we're proud of. And British Columbia spends the least per student on K-12 education. We spend the least per student on K-12 education, and we have the highest poverty rate of children. We're also a destination of choice for many immigrants moving into first-generation immigrants moving into Canada. So we have a very diverse kind of a place. So I'm just going to back up there, Audrey. Are you flipping my slides here?
Oh, sorry. You can go back.
Yep.
I see that we're going to be interrupted in 3 minutes for some of the questions, so just that's why.
Okay, I'll just do this equity piece. So the OECD looks at, one of their new studies is looking at equity, and of course as you move up the left-hand side, that is quality of learning, how high your actual scores are, and as you move to the right, it's equity, how much of the scores can be accounted for by the economic background of kids. So this was 2012 results. The test was done in 2012, so it's OECD 2013. And you can see the results there. Canada does quite well. We're up in the top right-hand quadrant, along with some other jurisdictions, including a flag you probably don't recognize, which is Estonia. And that's another story for another conversation. And you can see Great Britain and the U.S. kind of in the middle, right in there, along with Australia. So we do pretty well on equity. Then we spent a number of years, 3 or 4 years, really focusing on equity and focusing on the learning needs of our kids and transforming, saying this high performance isn't enough. We need to do some other things as well as just focusing on reading, writing, mathematics, and science. And in 2015, our results actually increased, which is causing a lot of hubbub out there around the world. I'm off to Harvard next week and Lisbon the week after to have exactly these conversations with other jurisdictions. And you can see up here now British Columbia is broken out. So you see British Columbia here, Quebec, and Alberta, Ontario down here, and you see some jurisdictions actually declining. So while we focused on transformation and we focused on the whole child and we focused on equity, we actually had increased results for all of our kids. And so for us, equity is hugely important. Pasi Sahlberg, who you likely know and have listened to and read, I've shamelessly ripped off his slides here, and he talks about by focusing on equity, you actually get increased performance. And you'll see the U.S. moving up and along. The U.S. actually improved the most in equity of any jurisdiction over that time. Still a long way to go, but is moving in the right direction.
Rod, if I can interrupt you now, so because I know there's
Please.
a lot of questions in the chat box, and I want to make sure that we get to our participant questions today. So And I know there's lots more wonderful information that you can share because you know this so deeply. But let me try and give you all both some real specific questions coming from our legislators and others. Has the demography or the demographic data of your Canadian teaching force kept up with the changing demographics of the province? So what can you say about that?
I can start and talk about British Columbia for sure. Audrey, I don't know if you have a greater sense of the Canadian perspective. I have some sense of that. In British Columbia, I would say yes. The demographic of our teaching force is changing quickly. It is far more diverse. I think it represents many of our growing diverse population. The one area where it is not keeping pace is with our First Nations Aboriginal students. We still have a lot of work to do there to ensure that we have First Nations teachers in our regular everyday classrooms, teachers and principals and vice principals and so on. However, in terms of other ethnic backgrounds, yeah, we are rapidly becoming quite diverse, and I'd say in British Columbia we're pretty close to about the right proportions.
So, Audrey, were there any particular policy moves that influenced that? Audrey or Rod, do you know anything politically that was done?
Politically, that created a demographic change in teaching?
Yes, the shift. What
no, I would go back to, no, there was no, none of the policies we looked at that. It was more creating the need and in communities, and when I talk about communities, I talk about regions and provinces and so on, that's what our teaching force needed to look like. It also goes back to our secondary schools, where I think we have very equitable access to post-secondary, and I think that changed our demographics. I'm talking about BC, Alberta, and Ontario that I know that did it. So you go back to how we are allowing our grads to go to our teaching force.
Well, do you think, Rod, were the universities deliberate in trying to attract students with diverse backgrounds? I know you have a lot of universities in partnership with districts. Is that what led to the growth?
I think partly. Universities aren't very discriminating, at least in British Columbia, as to who they let into the teacher preparation programs. But I think that was part of it. And I think the only policy that I can speak to was around Aboriginal First Nations teachers. A number of districts across the province tried to get a human rights exemption in place to allow them to differentiate and to give preferential hiring to First Nations teachers. It didn't work very well, and I'm not sure solved the problem. Many places like our district have abandoned that approach and are just working through other avenues to try to encourage more First Nations and Aboriginal people to become teachers. For example, we are currently offering, and it's slightly different, but a teacher assistant program that we're actually offering locally in our district, but on a dual credit basis. So our grade 12 and 11 students can actually take the vast majority of a program to become fully certified teaching assistants before they graduate. And so they graduate, they've got about 3/4 of that program done, and then another 8 or 9 months they are fully able to be hired. And we have done that in cooperation with our First Nations, our local First Nations groups. So probably 50% of those people in that program are Aboriginal. So we just are trying to find ways to make it work.
Okay, thanks. There was a question, and I think it's an interesting one, about what do you mean when you say professional networks support inquiry? So professional networks in schools, across schools, and then somebody's interested in what do professional networks look like in more remote areas of the country. So I'm going to pass that question to you, Rod, first, but Audrey, at the same time, there's lots of questions in the chat box that both of you can be responding in the chat box as well. So if you'll take time to type some answers in there, that would be wonderful. Rod, how do they look different and alike?
So how they look different and alike. So let's start with the first part, the question, I think, how professional networks connect with inquiry and support inquiry. If a teacher or a group of teachers has an inquiry question, and we certainly encourage that to happen, and it generally does happen in groups. It might be 2 or 3 teachers, it might be a whole school. They have a question about practice. They're doing an inquiry on it. How is it that they find out information? How do they gather that information from other practitioners and other experts? We find that that's where the support of learning networks comes in, that they reach out to one of a variety of networks that we have and connect themselves into other like-minded educators who are struggling with the same inquiry and are supported that way. So it's questions first, inquiry first, networks surround the people involved in that to help them answer it and move their practice forward, bring in other expertise, etc. So that's sort of the connection there. In terms of ruralness, we have lots of technology, and we found that that's a great way to connect people in. What we are finding, however, interestingly enough, is that the flow is actually beginning to work quite quickly the other way. We are finding that it's our smaller rural schools and districts that are the most innovative and the ones that are coming to solutions more quickly because they tend to be smaller schools. They tend to approach learning a bit less like a factory and a bit more like a family and a bit more collectively. And so we're finding large urban schools reaching out to rural places, trying to find the magic that they are doing with their kids. And so we're finding ways to connect people in technologically. We do have a network here in the province of small rural secondary schools that meets face-to-face once a year and electronically the rest of the time. So we have a number of those kinds of networks. But it's interesting, the learning flow is actually happening as much or more from big city reaching out to the smaller places, trying to find the answers to the questions they've already solved.
The other piece I would add to the answer to that question, because I see there's more than one in the chat box, is that if we're talking about an inquiry and groups of teachers, I think we need to underline maybe a myth that we've created that we're not looking for expertise. It's once the teachers or a district knows what the problem is, then we reach out for the expertise. So the expertise is tailored to the context and to the problem in the school district. That is also true of Alberta. I can't say I know Alberta and BC, but so I wanted to dispel a myth that we don't use experts.
Right.
Okay, and there's a question about personalized learning, and that's a huge trend in the U.S. And to what degree would you say, how are you all responding? I know you're aware of the movement. How are you responding in the province? What are you hearing about it? And what are you doing as a superintendent, Rod?
We are all over personalized learning. That's the focus of everything that we do in this district, as well as, I would say, provincially. That's our main focus. We tend to use the term personalizing as opposed to personalized because it's a journey that we're on that we'll never get to the end. We want to have increasingly personal, the learning experiences of our kids should be increasingly personalized. So it's a direction of travel or flow rather than an end goal to get to. When are you fully personalized? I don't know what that means, but we want increasingly personalized learning experiences.
So, Rod, let me interrupt you a second, Nancy. How do you balance then personalizing learning for teachers and the power of the network learning? Here, when we say personalized learning for students, a lot of people say, well, then we need to make sure all professional learning for educators is personalized. How would you respond to that?
I would agree. I'm not sure about the word all, but much. An increasing proportion of the learning should be personalized. what we know to be true about learning for students, I believe is also true for learning for adults. I personally don't subscribe to the fact that there's a different learning models for adults as opposed to kids. We're all human beings, and I think we all learn in unique individual ways, and yet those basic ideas hold true for kids and adults. So we would expect. So when we talk about increasingly personalized learning experiences for kids, we know that doesn't mean individualized, and so we make a great distinction between personalized and individualized. We're not talking about plugging kids into computers. We're not talking about kids going off by themselves. We talk about kids actually working more collectively together, which might seem like having it backwards, but when kids work on inquiry, just like adults, they tend to find other students that are interested in similar things, and then they work collectively on that. That's still a personalized approach. And so we increasingly have students working in networks with other kids from same school, same class, different schools, different classes, different countries, on projects that they are personally interested in, and things that can be woven into the curriculum and still meet our curricular outcomes. Same basic concept for teachers is that by allowing greater personalization to happen, it is actually increasing the collective and networked approach that teachers are taking to their learning, because few people like to just learn on their own. There are some, but most like partners. They know what works better in teams, and let's get a group of like-minded people together that are going to approach some common inquiry. Same for adults as kids. Okay. Personalizing doesn't mean individualizing.
Right.
We're autonomy within inquiry. There's great autonomy within our inquiry.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I actually referenced everybody to another report that talked about the inquiry work in British Columbia in the chat box. So one final question for you all. Again, as we talked about in preparing for this webinar, that this group work on policy at the state level in the U.S. So both of you have tremendous experience in provincial government. What's your one or two big pieces of advice if they are all about transforming and improving education in their state? Audrey, can I go to you first?
Well, I would go to the slide that's sitting up there now about the social.
Okay.
I think for me, that's the big piece. That's where I started. That government's an enabler, not a driver. And I think, in my experience at government over 10 years, that was very clear to me. Change is done with people, not to them.
Right.
And consultation is not enough. It's co-construction that builds the trust, and it's that autonomy within a collective, because you need both, and it's a dilemma, but it works. So that would be
very powerfully stated, Audrey. Thanks, Rod. Do you have anything to add since we're almost at the top of the hour?
Yeah, I would just underscore this slide over and over and over again. So, as in charge of the transformation here in the province, I would go to groups and say, I promise never to consult with you. We will only co-construct from the beginning. Consulting, someone else is actually doing something and has the pen and has the lead, and we're just going to check in with you. And we all know that consultation is often fake and phony. You've already got the product shrink wrapped sitting in the basement and just checking a box. And so once we got people to really understand that we were co-constructing, and that is both government, inside government and outside government. So inside government, what that meant is I had to have my minister understanding we were going to start putting out public documents that weren't ready yet. And we knew they weren't ready. And that was the point. They weren't ready. But we were putting them out in various phases. We were actually going to change them. We got comments back from lots of our partners going, holy smokes, when you say draft, you really mean draft. Yeah, we really mean draft. And so that was a big difference. That was something hard for government to swallow. That's not typically how government works. Also, I'd go back to the enabler piece, is that that was also a tough one for government, when often governments want and politicians want to be seen to be I am driving this change. Because that gets back to who gets credit for it. Who gets the win? See, I made this happen. And we were really careful and worked very hard with our political leaders as well as our bureaucratic leaders to ensure that it was a collective win. If we really want this to happen, we are all going to be able to take credit for this, and we're all going to be able to take credit for it because we're working in different and unique ways. And so that was a big ongoing conversation inside government and outside government.
It's an incredible story, and 1 hour doesn't really do justice, but I think everybody got a great taste of the transformation that occurred in British Columbia that led to that great spot in the PISA results that we were able to show. So I hope we gave you some insight into the British Columbia and the broader Canadian perspective, enough that will whet people's appetite that they'll want to dig into the report. Michelle, what else can we do for you today?
This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you all so much for sharing this information. I know our international study group and other legislators and staff will definitely want to continue to dig into this just based on the questions that we have in the chat box. If you would like to send your questions through me, or I know Stephanie has added the email addresses for our two speakers from Canada in the chat box, I would encourage you to feel free to reach out and get your questions answered. So once again, I just thank you both for this, and I just wanted to also announce that we are going to continue with our series of webinars. We have another one that we are just finalizing that will be focused more specifically on teacher preparation and what some of the states are doing here around the efforts to try to improve teacher preparation with the Council of Chief State School Officers. That will be scheduled in mid-June. And in July, we are hoping to have Linda Darling-Hammond, staff from the National Center for Education and the Economy, and a couple of the other researchers that worked with Linda on her book about what other high-performing countries are doing around teaching. So stay tuned for those dates, and we'll make sure to get that to you. As we mentioned, the webinars are archived, and every time I send out an invite, I'm also including information on the archived webinars, so we encourage everybody to visit these if you have additional questions or if you need a refresher on some of what they said. And if you need to be put in touch with the speakers, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know. Thank you, everyone, and this concludes this webinar. I would ask our International Education Study Group members to stay on the line. We will be continuing our conversation after the webinar concludes. Jessica just posted information in the chat box with the telephone number for you to stay on this line in case for some reason you get dropped off and you need to call back in, or in case you are joining us from your computer.
Great, thank you. This does conclude today's webinar portion of the call. And as a reminder, NCSL International Study Group members and partners, please stay on the line. All other participants, we thank you for your participation. Please disconnect your lines at this time and have a great day.